Okay, so we've come quite a long way in our understanding of the MongoDB query language. Let's take a look now at using dot notation in the Node.js driver. And we'll do this by extending our application where we pass command line arguments onto our app and build queries based on those arguments. So here, we're going to add an option for querying with respect to an IPO. If you remember when we walked through our example document, there's a top-level IPO field, and the IPO field has as its value an embedded document, including entries for valuation amount, currency, when the IPO happened, and the stock symbol. So we're going to use that data to extend the flexibility of our application in terms of the types of queries that we can do with it. So if you remember, we take our command line options and pass them to our query document function, where we build the query document that will be passed along to find. Taking a look at our query document function, we can see that there's now a little bit of additional code for dealing with IPO. But before we look at that, I want to show you that we've added now an entry to the acceptable command line args, stipulating IPO as the name with the alias I, the type being string. Okay, so with this entry here, parse will now look for a command line argument for IPO, and if it finds one, make it part of the options object that it creates. Okay, so everything in our query document function is the same up to this point. So now let's take a look at how we deal with IPO. Now, just to make things a little bit more interesting, this IPO parameter allows us to specify yes or no as the value for the parameter. So on the command line here, I can specify -i and yes, or -i and no. Okay, and you see that I get very different numbers of matching documents. And I can also leave it off, or rather than do both employees and IPO, I can leave off employees and use the IPO parameter with either yes or no specified there. Okay, so what are the semantics for this particular parameter? Well, if the user specifies yes as the value for the IPO command line argument, then that means we want to query for documents where the valuation amount for IPO is a field that exists and is not equal to null. Okay? So where this field exists and has an actual value as opposed to just being set to null. If no is specified, then we're looking only for documents where there is no evaluation amount specified. Now that can happen in one of two ways. Either the value for this field can be set to null, or it can simply not exist. Okay? Now at a higher level, what we're saying here is, if I specify yes for IPO, then I only want to see companies that have gone to IPO. If you're not familiar with the term IPO, IPO stands for Initial Public Offering. If I specify no, that means I want to see only companies that have not had an IPO. And finally, if I leave off this option altogether, so do something like this, or like this, then I'm saying I don't care. Show me companies that have gone to IPO and those that haven't. Either way is fine. Now let's take a look at the syntax that we use for amending our query document, and then also exactly what we're using as the portion of the query document that pertains to IPO. Okay, so again, we initially constructed our query document using this syntax. Okay, this is exactly the same thing as doing something like this. Okay, exactly the same. However, it's more common to write this way in our code because it's far more readable. Okay, so once this statement is done, we will have an object with one property or field, founded_year, whose value is another object with two fields, one with a key $GTE and another with a key $LTE. Then, if there is an employee's value specified on the command line, we will add another field to our query document using this syntax, specifying that we only want to see documents with a number of employees greater than or equal to whatever was specified as the number of employees on the command line. In this last case, that number was 100. Okay? And then finally here, what we're doing is we're using dot notation to specify something about the valuation amount for the IPO embedded document. Okay? So first, let's take a look at what this looks like in terms of the query that gets constructed. Here we see our range for the year in which the company was founded, our one-ended range for number of employees, and then finally we see IPO.valuation underscore amount. Okay, so here we're using dot notation to reach into this nested document here and take a look at the value of IPO.valuation amount for all documents in our collection. And what we're saying here is I only want to see documents where IPO.valuation amount is a field that exists and, remember this is an implicit and here, are not equal to null. So where the IPO valuation amount field exists and where its value is not null. So let's contrast that with entering no as our value. We're here again using dot notation, but now just specifying null as the value for IPO.valuation amount. Okay, meaning that I only want to see documents where the IPO.valuation amount is either set to null or doesn't exist at all. That's the semantics of specifying null as a field value in a query document, as we've done here. Are there any questions? If so, I encourage you to hit the forums and ask for any clarification you may need about what we're doing here. Okay, now the last thing that I want to touch on is how we're setting the query document value for this IPO.valuation amount. Okay, we have represented here essentially the three different ways in which I can set field values in JavaScript objects. I can use this very explicit convenience syntax here, something that looks very much like how we construct JSON objects in the Mongo shell. I can use this dotted syntax on the query object itself, accessing a property of that field and assigning a value to that property. I can also access my JavaScript object as if it were an array. Now in JavaScript, objects effectively are arrays. They're associative arrays, basically being a list of key value pairs. So I can specify the key that I'm interested in inside square brackets, much like I could if I were indexing into an array using a 0 or 1, 2, and so on, whatever the index value was I was interested in. In this case, I'm actually interested in a field for which I'm going to designate this string as a key, IPO.valuation underscore amount. Okay? The end result there then, for a call to this application like this, is that I will have a query object that has a founded year field, an employees field, and an IPO.valuation amount field. Okay? The value for my founded year field will be this embedded or nested document. The value for my IPO.valuation amount, if I specified yes for IPO on the command line, will be this embedded document, which essentially specifies two constraints on the IPO.valuation amount field. And in the case where I specified no on the command line, the value for IPO.valuation amount will simply be null. And that's how I arrive at query documents that look like this, or which look like this. So in constructing your queries within JavaScript using the Node.js driver, we simply use standard techniques used in JavaScript to create and assign values to JavaScript objects. There are three primary ways in which we can do this. One using this convenience syntax using curly braces. Another being this means of referencing a field of an object using a dot, much in the same way that we would reference a method of an object using a dot. And then finally, we can access fields within an object in JavaScript using this array-like syntax. So this provides us with a nice example of using dot notation in the Node.js driver and provides a nice meaty example for some of the things we can do in terms of taking in input and using that input to query MongoDB.